Hey, it's Casual Tuesday, and I want to talk to you about weeks 7, 8, and 9. I already did a video where I mentioned some commonalities, but this is going to be a little more specific based on some of your papers that I read. So in week 7, we deal with the Fed papers, and we address two ideas about how the government is structured. First, we talk about why power is separated. We have the judicial, executive, and legislative branches because those are the three natural functions of power of any power structure. And so by separating them, and pitting them against one another in a government, human nature being fallible as it is a way to guard against the natural amassing of power in any institution. Right? It creates longer stability, longevity, and it prevents reactionary types of stuff. It also protects the interests of the individual. We also, in 47 and 51 both, we talk about the federal system, 51 more actually. We talk about the separation between the federal government with the three branches of power and all of the individual state governments, each with its own three branches of power. In this way, we have a double protection against our individual liberties. And if you think for a moment, it's great that we have some federal civil rights law that says, listen, you just can't exclude people anywhere in the country if they don't fit into your in-group. Take your pick of identity. That's a no-no. Shouldn't do it. Good. But there are a lot of other, outside of that, there are a lot of other little ways that people prefer to live their lives and run their societies, from Omaha, Nebraska to Atlantic, Iowa, to Portland, Oregon, to Seattle, Washington, to San Francisco, to Chicago. All of those places have different cultures and values, and so the society should have those things instituted in the governments that they constitute, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Again, with the exclusion of treating people badly or unfairly. But economic policy, redistributive policy, obscenity types of laws. Some you have very conservative places, you have very liberal places. They should be able to have laws that reflect their values within reason. Okay. In week 8, we talk about human rights. They expand a lot over time. The U.S. and French documents are legal documents, legally binding, created by a government within borders and a military to enforce those laws. The UN is a voluntary organization that is not legally binding, and the human rights document of the UN is not legally binding either. Take it or leave it, it's up to you. It's a suggestion. And it's also a much more expansive set of human rights, also coming out of the Western liberal tradition, but with so many more rights that it's, well, there's a lot more cultural conflict that we will find, and Thomas Frank mentions that. Now, in week 9, we talk about the interstate system, and this is where I want to bring week 7 back in. We have 3 concepts in week 9 that I think are probably important to understand. Globalism, globalization, they're different, and nationalism. So let's define these terms a little bit, and then we'll bring week 7 back into the discussion. Okay, so nationalism. Let's exclude ethno-nationalism and white nationalism and religious nationalism and all those negative identity things. Nationalism, generally speaking, is just the preference for the supremacy of the nation state as opposed to any other governing structures in the world. You can get to patriotism a little bit, you talk about the love of your country, yada yada, but in this context, let's think of nationalism as, right, preference for the autonomy and supremacy of individual states, which is partly how we operate ever since the Treaty of Westphalia in about the early 1400s. Globalism is an ought. It's an ideology. It's a claim. The world ought to operate with a one world government and all of the individual nation states subservient to that one world government. And in that way, we can draw a correlation to week 7, right? And the separation of federal and state powers. And if you think about it, if you did like the idea of a one world government, of a globalist perspective, there are some hiccups, because how are we going to determine what laws are to be forced on the world when you can't really square the difference in values and perspectives of, let's say, Sweden or Belgium versus Saudi Arabia or Iran? Some pretty big value differences there, and that's just not going to work well. There's going to be a lot of resentment and frustration. But that's the type of thing that a one world government would have to work around and figure out. I have a preference for one over the other, but your values will direct you towards one of those two as you learn more about them. Okay, so nationalism, globalism, globalization. Globalization is not an ought. It's not a claim of what should be. It's simply a statement of what is. As humans have developed over history, we have interacted more with different groups across the world. And as technology advanced through roads, and then boats, and then planes, and then social media, we have interacted culturally, politically, militarily. And that's just globalization. It is just the factual interaction of humans across the world. There's ups and downs, mostly ups. And so hopefully this helps you to put in perspective week 7, week 8, week 9, how the separation of powers on a state level like the United States can be understood or applied to a broader right world perspective, and how human rights run the challenge of not necessarily being applicable everywhere, depending on what your view of human rights are. I'll give you my example. I don't think there are that many human rights, and I certainly don't think that the UN document offers an entirely legitimate perspective, though I agree with many of them, not all of them. And understandably, there are cultures across the world, their values won't comport with values of other places. And so we can't just have one set of rules for everyone, just like we don't even in one country. Talk to you later.